Case number 1. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos. Across Colombia, children were vanishing. A boy missing in Valle del Cauca, another in Boyacá, another in Meta. Cases scattered across 11 states, different towns, different families, different years. At first, each disappearance looked like its own tragedy. A child who wandered too far, a family's private heartbreak. The national headlines weren't connecting them. Local investigators weren't connecting them. Each case existed in its own silo, mourned by one family at a time, in communities that often lacked the resources or the political weight to demand more. Colombia in the 1990s was a country managing simultaneous crises: guerrilla conflict, narco-violence, political instability that consumed the attention of law enforcement and the national media alike. A pattern of missing boys in poor communities was not, in that context, the story that forced its way to the front. But as the years passed, investigators began seeing something no one wanted to believe. The missing children were connected, and one man had moved through the country for nearly a decade before anyone fully understood what was happening. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos. Born on January 25th, 1957, in Genova, Quindío, he was the eldest of 7 children raised in poverty in Western Colombia. His childhood, by his own account, was marked by persistent abuse, a volatile father, a household defined by chaos and neglect. He left home at 16 and spent the years that followed drifting from town to town, a handyman, an itinerant laborer, a man who carried no fixed address and left no reliable record of where he had been. He had a documented history of alcoholism and psychiatric illness. He also carried a carefully constructed set of disguises. Colombian media would eventually give him the nickname El Cura, the priest, because of his most effective persona, a monk or clergyman who approached children with warmth, with small gifts, with the quiet authority that a religious figure commands in communities where the church has deep roots. He changed his name regularly, altered his appearance, and moved on before patterns could form. He was almost impossible to track precisely because nothing about him stayed the same long enough to be noticed. His targets were boys, almost always between the ages of 8 and 16. Children of street vendors. Children living apart from their families because their parents couldn't afford to keep them close. Children whose disappearances, in a country already overwhelmed by political violence and instability, might not immediately trigger national attention. And honestly, that calculation is one of the most disturbing parts of this entire case. Because the vulnerability of his victims wasn't accidental. It was deliberate and strategic. He understood exactly who would go unnoticed, and he targeted those children specifically, the ones whose absence created the smallest ripple in the world around them. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito operated across Colombia in a pattern that was both systematic and carefully mobile. He lured boys with money or food, led them on walks into isolated areas, and killed them using ropes, blades, and knives, while heavily intoxicated. Bodies were buried or abandoned across the countryside, often in locations that gave investigators nothing to search. The first major break came in 1997, when investigators discovered a mass grave near the city of Pereira, containing the remains of 36 boys. Authorities initially suspected a satanic cult. The scale of what they were actually dealing with was still entirely beyond comprehension. As the investigation deepened, more graves emerged. More states were implicated. More families received the answers they had been dreading for years. Eventually, the investigation converged on a single man. Detectives traced Garavito through a name provided by a former restaurant owner he had worked for, confirmed his identity through DNA extracted from personal belongings, including samples taken from his pillow, while he was briefly away from his cell during an interrogation, and located him in Villavicencio near Bogota. On April 22, 1999, he was arrested on suspicion of attempting to rape a 12-year-old named John Ivan Sabagal. Authorities held him for months while the case built. On October 28, 1999, he confessed. Then he led investigators to burial sites, including mass graves scattered across multiple states, that confirmed everything the evidence had been building toward. On December 13, 1999, a Colombian court convicted Garavito of 138 murders and sentenced him to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison, the longest sentence in Colombian judicial history. A number so staggering it immediately circled the globe. But then came a detail that stopped people cold. Colombian law at the time capped actual imprisonment at 30 years. And because Garavito had cooperated with investigators, guiding them to victims' remains, his sentence was further reduced through a guilty plea to 22 effective years. The outrage was immediate and entirely understandable. Colombian law was subsequently amended, raising the maximum sentence to 40 years. But for the families of those 138 convicted victims, and the dozens more whose deaths were never formally tried, the legal reality felt impossibly small against the scale of what had been done to them. And honestly, the final chapter of the case carries its own complexity. Garavito remained incarcerated at the Valledupar prison for the rest of his life. He never walked free. On October 12th, 2023, at the age of 66, he died in a prison hospital in Valledupar from cancer. And in a case full of numbers that defy comprehension, that last detail is perhaps the one that matters most. The sentence was 1,853 years. The time served was 24. Somewhere in the arithmetic between those two numbers are 138 children, the confirmed ones. Each of them a family, each of them a name, each of them someone who was supposed to come home. Case number 2, Pedro Alonso Lopez. Some criminal cases end with a verdict, some end with a sentence, some end with a death in custody, a final chapter that the world can point to and say, it is over. The file's close. The families have something that at least resembles an answer, however inadequate. And then there are cases like this one. His name was Pedro Alonso Lopez. He was born on October 8th, 1948, in the municipality of Venadillo, in Colombia's Tolima department. The 7th of 13 children raised in a household defined by poverty and instability. His mother, a woman involved in the adult industry, expelled him from the home at a young age after discovering troubling behavior toward a relative. He was later taken in by an adult who mistreated him. He was arrested for auto theft in 1969 and sent to a correctional facility for 7 years, where he became involved in a serious conflict with 3 other inmates. He later confronted them again within the facility, resulting in a fatal outcome. Authorities ruled the incident self-defense and added 2 years to his sentence. By the time he was released, whatever path had been leading him somewhere else had narrowed completely, and there was no turning back from the direction he was already moving in. Throughout the late 1970s, young females were going missing across 3 countries: Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Young girls, mostly between 9 and 12 years old, from poor and marginalized communities. Indigenous villages in the Andes, market towns in the lowlands, different police forces, different databases, different languages. Investigators in each country had no reliable mechanism for sharing information, for comparing cases across national borders. And Lopez moved between countries like water through cracks, exploiting the gaps that a continental investigation would have needed years to close. And honestly, The structural failure that allowed him to operate across 3 jurisdictions for so long is one of the most important and uncomfortable aspects of this entire case, because those gaps still exist in different forms in every international investigation today. Authorities eventually linked him to the confirmed murders of at least 110 people. He himself claimed more than 300 victims. The scale defies ordinary understanding. Even the lower number, the conservative, confirmed figure, represents a level of violence that stretched across a decade and an entire continent. The uncertainty surrounding the real total creates a different kind of fear than a precise number would, because it means nobody truly knows, even now. Even with everything investigators assembled, he was arrested on March 9th, 1980, in the Ecuadorian city of Ambato. A woman screams at a supermarket drew customers toward him as he fled with a 12-year-old girl in his arms. He was caught on the street. When investigators searched, he led them to 53 graves in Ecuador alone. The true scope of what he had done across 3 countries began to surface, and it was worse than even experienced investigators had anticipated. The investigation in Ecuador alone was staggering in scope. Investigators searched areas Lopez directed them to and found 53 graves. In Peru, during his earlier period of operation, he had been captured briefly by members of an indigenous community who recognized what he was doing. An American missionary intervened and persuaded the community to hand him over to Peruvian authorities, rather than execute him there. Those authorities released him shortly afterward. He then crossed into Ecuador. The trajectory of the case is, at every stage, a record of what happens when institutions make the wrong decision at the wrong moment. Ecuador tried and convicted him. On January 25th, 1981, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. On August 31st, 1994, he was released 2 years early for good behavior. He was rearrested on the spot as an illegal immigrant and deported to Colombia. There, prosecutors attempted to charge him with a decades-old murder case. A judge declared him insane and committed him to a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá. The entire handling of the case, each transfer, each declaration, each decision, made the next one seem less believable than the last. In April 1998, doctors at that hospital declared him sane. He was released on $50 bail. He was required to report to police monthly. He never did. The conditions of his release, $50 bail, monthly check-ins with a police force that had no particular mechanism for enforcing them, were entirely inadequate to the situation. They were the conditions applied to a man with minor legal violations, not to someone investigators in 3 countries had linked to more than 100 murders. Whether anyone involved in that release decision fully understood who they were releasing is a question the record does not clearly answer. The last confirmed sighting of Pedro Alonso Lopez was in Bogotá in September 1999. Then he was gone, as completely as his victims had been. In 2002, Interpol issued a warrant for his arrest in connection with a new murder. In 2005, that warrant was quietly deactivated. No confirmed sighting, no verified death, no explanation. He would be 77 years old today if he is still alive. And that is the detail that separates this case from every other on this list. Not the scale of the crimes, not the inadequacy of the sentences. Though 16 years for more than 110 murders is itself almost impossible to justify. Not the $50 bail for one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. It is the silence at the end. Most cases, however disturbing, arrive at some form of conclusion. An answer, a grave somewhere with a name on it. A courtroom moment where something finally closes. This one ends with a question mark hanging over an entire continent. Case number 3. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch. When Argentinians first saw his photograph, most of them said the same thing. He didn't look like a killer. He looked young. He looked soft. He looked like someone you might see in a school hallway or at a corner store, unremarkable in every direction. The contrast between the face in the newspaper and the crimes attached to it was so severe that it became the defining detail of the case. Not the violence itself, but the gap between expectation and reality. Between what a monster is supposed to look like and what this particular one actually did. In a country that would spend decades trying to understand what he had done, that photograph became the entry point. The first question anyone asked was not how many, or where, or over how long. It was, how is this possible? How does someone who looks like this become responsible for that? His name was Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig. He was born on January 19th, 1952, in the Olivos neighborhood of Buenos Aires province, the son of a working-class family. Shy as a child, by his own later description, ordinary in nearly every observable way. The crime reporters covering his arrest noted repeatedly that the reaction from people who had encountered him in his neighborhood, in the streets around Olivos, was consistent confusion. He had seemed like everyone else. He had not seemed like someone capable of this. He had two accomplices during his crime spree, both childhood friends from the same neighborhood. The first was Jorge Antonio Ibanez. The second was Hector Somoza. Between March 1971 and February 1972, the three of them moved through the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires, committing armed robberies. What set their crimes apart was what happened to the people they found inside. The Buenos Aires nightlife district had been a regular target for armed robberies in those years, and investigators at first had no reason to connect the crimes that began appearing in March 1971. The method was consistent across cases, but without a name attached to it. Each crime existed in its own file. The first robbery at the Enamor nightclub in Olivos on March 15, 1971, established the template. Enter in the early morning hours, take the money, kill anyone who could describe you. The owner and the night watchman were shot in their sleep. Night watchmen, nightclub owners, store operators, people doing ordinary work at ordinary hours. Robledo Puig killed 11 of them, usually while they were asleep or unaware, using a ruby pistol at close range. The pattern was consistent. Break in before dawn, take what was there, eliminate anyone who could identify them later. The victims weren't chosen for personal reasons. They had no prior connection to him. They simply happened to be present when he arrived. And honestly, that particular coldness, the complete absence of personal grievance, made the crimes feel more chilling than crimes of passion ever could. The crime spree lasted 11 months. It ended through a mistake so straightforward, it is almost hard to believe. In early February 1972, during a break-in in the Buenos Aires district of Tigre, Robledo Puig accidentally shot and killed his second accomplice, Hector Somoza. He tried to cover his tracks by burning Somoza's face to prevent identification. He forgot to check Somoza's pockets. Inside them, Somoza's identity card. 3 days later, on February 4th, 1972, police arrested Robledo Puig at the age of 20. He confessed to every crime in precise detail, including robberies that had never even been reported to police, crimes his victims had apparently decided were not worth reporting. He sat in custody for 8 years before his trial. Argentina's legal procedures at the time moved slowly, and the case accumulated additional legal complexity. When the trial finally concluded in 1980, the court convicted him of 11 murders, 17 armed robberies, 1 attempted murder, and multiple sexual crimes. Before the sentence was read, Robledo Puig made a single statement to the court. "This was a Roman circus," he said. I was judged and sentenced beforehand. He received life imprisonment, the maximum available under Argentine law, and was transferred to Sierra Chica maximum security prison near the city of Olavarria. He later denied all involvement, claiming his confession had been coerced through torture. The courts were unconvinced. He has been incarcerated ever since. In July 2000, he became eligible for parole and chose not to apply. In November 2013, he formally requested either a review of his sentence or execution by lethal injection. Both requests were denied by the courts. A 2009 psychiatric evaluation found that he had been experiencing psychotic outbreaks since 2001, with what evaluators described as a wicked personality and dangerously suppressed aggression. In July 2017, after 45 years of continuous incarceration, he formally became the longest-serving prisoner in Argentina, a distinction he still holds today. As of 2026, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig is 74 years old. He has spent more than 54 years in prison, longer by a substantial margin than the entirety of his life before his arrest. He is currently held at the Lisandro Olmos facility near La Plata, a semi-open regime unit where, according to prison sources, he lives in near total isolation, receives no family visits, and passes his days playing chess with other inmates. His health has deteriorated. He has never expressed remorse. And that, perhaps, is the detail that keeps the case alive in the Argentine public memory. Not the crimes themselves, by now more than 5 decades old, but the silence where an explanation should be. The photograph that still doesn't match the record. And the question that no one in all those years has ever answered satisfactorily. How does someone who looked so ordinary become responsible for so much? Case number 4. Cayetano Santos Godinho. Most criminal investigations begin with adult suspects. Most case files describe people old enough to have built a life somewhere, to have made a series of deliberate choices over time, to fully carry the weight of what they did. This one was different in a way that made everyone who encountered it profoundly uncomfortable. And that discomfort has never fully disappeared from the historical record. By the time Buenos Aires police arrested Cayetano Santos Godinho in December 1912, they had been crossing paths with him for years, not yet as a suspect in murders, but as a child whose behavior had alarmed neighbors, teachers, and even his own father repeatedly enough that the family had turned him over to authorities more than once. The system had reviewed him, processed him, and returned him each time to the same household. And the violence had continued regardless, escalating with each passing year, each missed intervention, each time the machinery of the state concluded there was nothing actionable to be done. His name was Cayetano Santos Godinho. He was born on October 31st, 1896, in Buenos Aires, one of 9 or 10 siblings born to Italian immigrants who had come to Argentina hoping for something better and found poverty instead. His father, Fiore, had contracted syphilis before Cayetano's birth, a fact that would later become part of the clinical analysis of the case. Both parents were alcoholics. Both were abusive. By the age of 5, Cayetano was being expelled from schools for violence and a complete absence of interest in education or authority. By the age of 7, he had committed his first documented attack on another child, beating a 2-year-old and throwing him into a ditch. A nearby official intervened, and both children were released to their mothers within hours. Nothing further happened, and honestly, that first encounter with authority, the one that produced no consequence whatsoever, sets the pattern for everything that followed. The system saw him, assessed him, and returned him. Multiple times, over years. The violence never stopped. It escalated steadily, year by year, in scope and in seriousness. Animals were tortured and killed. Other children were attacked with rocks and whatever Godino could find. Arsons broke out across Buenos Aires neighborhoods. 7 fires that investigators would eventually connect to the same child who set them for reasons he never fully articulated, beyond what seemed to be a compulsion toward watching things burn and a need to create destruction. He could observe from a safe distance. At age 9, Godino's own father reported him to police for killing birds. A box of dead birds found under his bed, another inside one of his shoes. He was sent to a juvenile reformatory in Marcos Pass for 3 years. He escaped multiple times. Each time, he found his way back to Buenos Aires. The murders began, as far as investigators could later determine, in 1906. A 3-year-old girl named Maria Rosa Face, strangled, her death attributed at the time to causes that went unexplained, discovered to be his work only when Godino confessed to it years afterward. More attacks followed across the intervening years, some victims surviving by chance or intervention, others not. By 1912, the violence had accelerated into something unmistakable. 4 children were killed that year alone. 7 others were attacked and survived. On December 3rd, 1912, a child in his Buenos Aires neighborhood became his last confirmed victim. The following morning, December 4th, police arrested him at home. He was 15 years old by most accounts, possibly 16. He confessed to everything: the murders, the attempted murders, the arsons, and multiple crimes that had never been reported to anyone. Doctors who examined him declared him insane. He was committed to a psychiatric facility rather than tried as a criminal. Within a short time, he was transferred to the general prison population after attacking vulnerable psychiatric patients who posed no threat to him. He moved through multiple facilities over the following 3 decades, spending his final years at the Ushuaia Penitentiary in Tierra del Fuego, a facility so remote it was known, without irony, as the prison at the end of the world. On November 15th, 1944, Cayetano Santos Godino died there at the age of 48. The official cause of death was internal bleeding. Other accounts, and the prison culture of the time, suggest he was killed by fellow inmates who had grown furious after he killed a cat they had been keeping as a pet. His name entered the Argentine language permanently. Godino became a slur, used to describe someone who preys upon children, an insult that has carried the weight of the original case through generations. His story appeared in books, criminological studies, and case discussions for more than a century afterward. Not because the crimes were the most numerous or the most gruesome in Argentine history, but because they raised questions that nobody has ever satisfactorily resolved. What causes violence to emerge this early in a human life? What should a society do when a child is the danger? What is the responsibility of a system that keeps returning a damaged child to the same circumstances over and over until the damage becomes irreversible? Those questions still don't have clean answers, and they are not questions that can be answered by a legal proceeding or a psychiatric diagnosis. And honestly, the fact that they keep being asked more than a century later in criminology classrooms and case discussions around the world is itself a testament to how deeply this case cuts. Not just as a historical record, but as a question about human nature that none of us has yet found a satisfying way to close. Case number 5, Pedro Rodriguez Filho. There is a distinction in the study of serial violence between killers who target the most vulnerable and killers who target the dangerous. Pedro Rodriguez Filho was, by his own account and by the evidence, the second kind. Many of the people he killed were criminals themselves, drug traffickers, rapists, murderers, gang members, and fellow prison inmates he had appointed himself to punish. That single distinction separated him from nearly every other name on this list, and it made him one of the most debated figures in Brazilian criminal history for the better part of 5 decades. His full name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho. He was born on October 29, 1954, on a farm in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Minas Gerais. His father was physically abusive, violently so, even during his mother's pregnancy, which left Rodrigues born with a damaged skull that physicians attributed to the violence inflicted on his mother while she carried him. Violence was present from before his first breath. His father would later murder his mother and dispose of her remains. Rodrigues was still a teenager when that happened. He had already started killing by then. His first murder came at age 14, when he shot a security guard employed by a city councilman who had been stealing from school cafeteria workers who included his own father. From there, the killings expanded outward into something harder to categorize. A gang leader whose men had murdered his pregnant girlfriend, Botinha. Members of the rival gang. Drug traffickers he hunted down while hiding in Mogi das Cruzes. The nickname Pedrinho Matador, Little Pedro the Killer, followed naturally from the pattern that emerged. He was targeting people already living inside violence, and the public reaction that formed around him was complicated, and it has stayed complicated. Some Brazilians viewed him without ambiguity as a monster. Others saw a vigilante operating in a vacuum left by a justice system that consistently failed the communities he came from. Neither description was quite sufficient. And honestly, both descriptions kept being applied for decades precisely because the case resisted easy resolution. On May 24th, 1973, Rodrigues was arrested for the first time. He was 18. The charges against him were enough to generate a sentence of 126 years. But prison for Rodrigues was not an ending. It was a continuation. He kept killing inside the system, targeting inmates he had identified as rapists, murderers, or people he considered guilty of specific wrongs that had gone unpunished. By the time the prison killings were fully documented, he had killed at least 47 fellow inmates. His sentence climbed to 400 years. He confessed in total to more than 100 killings across his life outside and inside prison. And in one of the most discussed details of his entire case, while incarcerated, he located his father, who had been imprisoned for murdering his mother, found him in the prison system, attacked and killed him inside the prison. He described this in later interviews as settling an account that had been open since his childhood. The question of what Rodrigues Filho actually was, whether the category of vigilante has any meaningful moral weight when the person using it has killed more than 100 people, occupied Brazilian criminologists, journalists, and ordinary citizens for decades. His case was held up as evidence of a justice system that had failed its poorest communities so completely that individuals felt compelled to fill the void. It was also held up by others as evidence that romanticizing extrajudicial violence, regardless of who the targets are, produces exactly this kind of outcome. Both arguments were made with conviction. Neither was wrong. Brazil's law prohibited detaining a sane prisoner for more than 30 years. So in 2007, after 34 years of incarceration, Pedro Rodrigues Filho walked out of prison. A 400-year sentence became 34 years served. He was rearrested in 2011 on charges related to inciting a prison riot and deprivation of liberty, sentenced to 8 more years, and released on December 10th, 2018, after 7 years, on good behavior. After his final release, Rodrigues created a YouTube channel called Pedrinho X Matador. Pedrinho the X-Killer. He gathered 242,000 subscribers. He gave interviews. He spoke publicly against gang violence. He published a book and appeared in a documentary. He was, in his final years, a public figure openly discussing the crimes he had committed and the life he had led. A figure that Brazilian media found genuinely impossible to fully classify. He had killed more than 100 people by his own count. He had a following that treated him as a kind of celebrity. He had a tattoo that once read, "I kill for pleasure," that he had eventually covered up. He had spent the years between his 2018 release and his death moving between public attention and a kind of quiet semi-retirement. He went to church. He gave occasional interviews. He maintained his online presence. He had expressed in various forums that he did not regret the killings he had committed, but that he regretted the path that had led him to a life defined by violence. That distinction mattered to him. Whether it mattered to the families of the more than 100 people he had killed is not recorded. On the morning of March 5th, 2023, two masked men arrived in a black car outside a family member's home in Mogi das Cruzes. Rodriguez was sitting in a chair on the sidewalk. One attacker told a relative standing nearby, "It's none of your business. Take your daughter and go inside." They shot Pedro Rodriguez Filho. One of them then fatally assaulted him. The car sped away. No suspects were ever arrested. Pedro Rodriguez Filho was 68 years old. The list of people who had reason to want him dead was so long that investigators had almost nowhere to start. Case number 6, Francisco das Chagas, Rodriguez de Brito. One boy disappeared, then another, then another. Across the northeastern Brazilian states of Maranhão and Pará, families were losing their sons, children between the ages of 4 and 15, almost all from deeply impoverished communities, vanishing across towns and rural areas with no explanation that the official record could supply. For years, more than a decade, those disappearances were treated as individual tragedies rather than as connected events pointing toward a single source. And while investigators failed to connect the evidence that was accumulating in front of them, a bicycle mechanic named Francisco das Chagas, Rodriguez de Brito continued his crimes without interruption. He was born in 1964 in Caxias, Maranhão. His early life left few records that investigators could fully reconstruct. What he later told authorities was that he had been abused as a child and believed the killings were a form of revenge, an impulse he described in terms that suggested something beyond a rational calculation. "I did this," he told investigators, "because something was guiding me, directing me." Courts noted a documented mental disorder during his first sentencing, though the degree of impairment was judged insufficient to remove his criminal responsibility entirely. His victims were boys from the poorest communities in 2 Brazilian states, selected with what appeared to be deliberate calculation. Children from families with limited resources and limited political influence. Children whose disappearances might take longer to generate official attention, and whose families might be easier to dismiss when they came forward. He lured them away from their homes and communities with the simple promise of small gifts or a modest payment for easy work. He took them to isolated areas. He seriously harmed them, killed them, and concealed the remains. He buried them in shallow graves or concealed their remains in locations that seemed unlikely to be discovered. And when investigators finally raided his shack in a shanty town near São José de Ribamar, they found human bones buried beneath the floor of his home. His victims had been there all along, just below the surface of the place he lived. The communities he preyed upon lived for years with a fear they could feel but could not name. Mothers and fathers came to police stations with missing sons and left without answers. Human rights organizations publicly accused authorities of insufficient investigation because the victims were from poor families, a charge that the evidence, viewed in retrospect, makes very difficult to refute. Some residents genuinely unable to understand how children could vanish so completely and so consistently, began to suspect black magic rituals. The severe nature of what was done to the victims, injuries that seemed to fit no ordinary criminal pattern, and honestly, the confusion that spread through those communities, the genuine collective inability to understand what was happening right around them, is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire case. Because it was that very confusion and the indifference of investigators toward families who had no political power that allowed the crimes to continue for as long as they did. The scale of what authorities had failed to prevent for more than a decade would eventually prompt a national reckoning of its own. Human rights organizations pointed not only to the investigation of this particular case, but to what it represented about whose children receive protection and whose disappearances are treated as administrative problems to be filed rather than crimes to be solved. The answer to that question in Maranhão and Pará in the 1990s and early 2000s was clear. The children of the poor were not protected in the same way that other children were protected. That failure produced 42 victims. Eventually, the investigation arrived. In December 2003, Rodrigues de Brito was arrested in São Luís, Maranhão. The triggering factor was the disappearance of 15-year-old Jonathan Silva Vieira and physical evidence linking Rodrigues de Brito directly to him. When investigators searched his shack in the shanty town near São José do Ribamar, they found what they had not expected to find: the remains of children buried under the floor of a structure where a man had been living for years. He confessed to 16 murders initially, and then, as the investigation continued and investigators confronted him with evidence from other locations, the number grew, ultimately reaching 42 suspected victims across Maranhão and Pará, spanning crimes that stretched from 1991 to 2003. The legal process that followed was itself extraordinary. At least 11 separate trials were conducted over the course of nearly a decade. The first conviction came in October 2006, the murder of Jonathan Silva Vieira, resulting in a sentence of approximately 20 years and 8 months, with the presiding judge citing a mental disorder as a mitigating factor in the length of the sentence. Additional trials and additional convictions followed. By 2014, when a court sentenced him to 108 more years for 3 children murdered in 1997, the cumulative total across all proceedings had climbed to somewhere between 385 and 580 years, depending on the concurrent and consecutive calculations applied. He is still alive, still incarcerated. Brazil's sentencing limitations will determine how much of that number constitutes time actually served. For the families of Maranhão and Pará, the trials brought legal answers, convictions, sentences, formal findings of guilt that had been denied for more than a decade. Whether those answers carried anything resembling peace is a different question, one that no legal proceeding, however thorough, has ever had the power to resolve. Case number 7, Julio Perez Silva. The families kept coming back. They had missing daughters. They had dates. They had last known locations. They had names. And for years, the answer they received was always the same. She probably ran away. In northern Chile's Tarapacá region, specifically in and around the mining town of Alto Hospicio and the city of Iquique, young women and girls had been disappearing since the late 1990s. The victims were between 12 and 17 years old, all from families with limited means, all, in the initial assessment of investigators, categorized as voluntary runaways, teenagers who had made personal decisions to leave, the parents who showed up at police stations, sometimes again and again, insisting their daughters would never simply walk away from their lives without a word, were met in too many cases with the same institutional assumption. The girls had chosen this. The families were wrong. The investigations weren't warranted. Move on. The man responsible was Julio Segundo Perez Silva. Born on July 15, 1963, in Puchuncaví, Valparaíso, he had moved to Alto Hospicio and established himself as a colectivo driver, a shared taxi operator, one of hundreds serving a region where public transport was limited and the roads stretched long and empty into the Atacama Desert. He was, to anyone who encountered him, completely unremarkable. A driver, a familiar face, someone you might take a ride from without hesitation, because that is exactly what a colectivo driver is. A normal transaction, a trusted community service, a person you let into your life without a second thought. His victims were girls and young women from the communities around Alto Hospicio and Iquique. At least 14 of them, as investigators would eventually confirm. High school students, young women with plans and families and ordinary lives. Daughters from households that knew, from the moment they didn't come home, that something had gone deeply and irreversibly wrong. Perez offered free rides. He drove them away from the town and into the vast northern desert, into terrain where distances are enormous, witnesses are non-existent, and the landscape itself becomes an obstacle to discovery. He killed them there with blows to the head and disposed of the bodies by dropping them into deep, abandoned mine shafts, the derelict industrial infrastructure of a mining region that had left the land scattered with vertical pits hundreds of feet deep. Discovery was almost impossible by design. Alto Hospicio was a community defined by its isolation and its economic precarity. The mining industry that had once provided the region with stability had contracted, and the town had become a destination for internal migrants with few options and fewer resources. The girls who disappeared came from these families who had come north looking for something better and found themselves living in a place where their daughters could go missing, and the official response was a shrug. The assumptions investigators made, that girls from poor migrant families in a struggling northern town were likely runaways, were not made without context. They were made about a specific kind of family, in a specific kind of place, and they were wrong. Beginning in 1998 and continuing through 2001, the disappearances accumulated. Families petitioned courts. They demanded formal investigations. They were largely ignored. Their daughters classified as runaways by authorities who had already settled on the most comfortable explanation. And honestly, it is difficult to look back at that period without a deep and specific frustration that resists easy resolution. Because the pattern was visible, the geography was concentrated, the similarities between cases were not subtle. They simply weren't being examined by the people whose professional obligation it was to examine them. Police assumptions about the social standing of the victims' families created a blind spot that cost lives that had no reason to be lost. The case broke on October 4th, 2001. A 13-year-old girl who had been abducted and attacked by Perez managed to escape. She gave investigators a description precise enough to lead them directly to him. Perez was arrested that same day. He confessed. He led police to the mine shafts where he had disposed of the bodies, or what could be reached of them, given the depth of some of the shafts. The Chilean government issued a formal public apology to the families of 7 confirmed victims on October 13th, 2001, 9 days after his arrest, acknowledging explicitly that police prejudice toward families from poor communities had allowed the killings to continue. It was a remarkable admission, rare in its directness. It didn't restore anything, but it acknowledged on the official record precisely what had happened and precisely why it had been allowed to go on. The trial itself exposed more than just the evidence against Perez Silva. Testimony from police officials, reconstructed through the investigation and subsequent reporting, made clear that the assumptions that had led investigators to classify the disappearances as voluntary were not random errors. They were the product of a specific institutional posture toward poor families from marginal communities, a posture that the government's apology acknowledged, but that no criminal proceeding could fully address. On February 26, 2004, Julio Perez Silva was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment, with parole eligibility beginning no earlier than after 40 years served. He is currently 62 years old, incarcerated at the high-security penal enclosure at CCP Colina 1, outside Santiago. He would not be eligible for parole consideration until approximately 2041. 14 families received answers in that courtroom. Most of them had known the truth long before investigators were willing to listen. And what finally broke the case was not a forensic breakthrough or an investigative turning point. It was a 13-year-old girl who survived and who went directly to police and who told them exactly what she had seen. That is not a detail that should be easy to move past. Case number 8, Marcelo Costa de Andrade. Some cases are disturbing because of the violence, some because of the victim count. But every so often, a case emerges where the most unsettling detail isn't what happened. It is why the offender genuinely believed it was happening. And that distinction between what was done and what the person doing it sincerely understood about it is what separates this case from every other on this list and makes it uniquely resistant to the categories we normally use. His name was Marcelo Costa de Andrade. He was born on January 2nd, 1967 in Rio de Janeiro and grew up in Rocinha, one of the largest favelas in the city, a place where poverty, hardship, and institutional neglect existed simultaneously and continuously. His stepfather treated him harshly. At 10, he was mistreated by an older individual. At 14, he turned to survival crime on the streets to get by. He was sent to a reform school and escaped. By 16, he had entered a long-term association with an older individual. At 17, he committed a serious offense against his own younger brother. None of this was hidden from the institutions that passed through his life. None of it produced intervention sufficient to alter what was coming. During this same period, Andrade became deeply and genuinely involved with a Pentecostal church in his community, attending services 4 or 5 times a week, and sometimes remaining for 5 hours at a time. He genuinely believed, as he later explained in extensive detail to investigators and psychiatrists, that a priest had told him that children who died before the age of 13 automatically went to heaven. He misunderstood this, or reinterpreted it through a framework already badly distorted by trauma and untreated illness, as something closer to a directive. Killing young boys in the architecture of his beliefs was not destruction, it was an act of elevation. He was sending them somewhere better than the slum where they had been born. And honestly, that is the detail that makes this case uniquely difficult to hold in the mind. Because unlike offenders who construct religious justifications after the fact for legal or strategic purposes, the psychiatric record in this case strongly supports the conclusion that Andrade genuinely believed what he said he believed. The consistency of his statements across years of evaluation is not consistent with fabrication. He was, in the most precise clinical sense of the term, delusional. And the delusion was complete. Between April and December 1991, 9 months, Andrade murdered 14 boys in the area surrounding Itaboraí, approximately 30 kilometers from Niterói in Rio de Janeiro state. His victims were between 6 and 13 years old, all from families living in the same slums he had come from. He killed them. He engaged in disturbing post-mortem acts with at least 2 of them, believing, as he stated clearly and repeatedly, that this would make him beautiful. He believed both the killing and these acts served purposes he could explain in theological terms. The investigation that followed his arrest moved quickly by Brazilian standards of the time. Andrade cooperated fully, leading investigators to the remains of his victims across the Itaboraí area, describing each crime with a level of detail that confirmed the locations. He showed no hesitation, no remorse, and no apparent awareness that his cooperation was anything other than a neutral act. He had done what he believed was right. The bodies were evidence of that. The prosecutors and investigators working the case found themselves in the unusual position of assembling a case against a man who was helping them do it. The case ended in December 1991 because of a 10-year-old boy named Altair de Abreu. Andrade had developed an attachment to him, had killed Altair's 6-year-old brother, and had then tried to persuade Altair to come live with him in the woods. Altair escaped. He went directly to police. On December 18th, 1991, Andrade was arrested. He confessed fully and led investigators to the remains of his victims. On April 26, 1993, following extensive psychiatric evaluation by multiple specialists, a court declared him criminally irresponsible under Brazilian law. He was never tried for the murders. Instead, he was committed to the Heitor Carrillo Psychiatric Hospital in Rio de Janeiro. In January 1997, he escaped from the hospital. He was rearrested 2 weeks later, reportedly attempting to make his way to the Holy Land. He was returned to custody and transferred to the Hospital de Custodia e Tratamento Psiquiátrico Enrique Roxo, where he has remained ever since. The Hospital de Custodia e Tratamento Psiquiátrico Enrique Roxo, where he has been held since 1997, operates under a system that evaluates patients annually to assess whether their condition has changed sufficiently to alter their legal status. In Andrade's case, that evaluation has produced the same conclusion for more than 3 decades. The psychiatric illness has not resolved. The legal status has not changed. He remains where he was placed in 1997. He is evaluated annually. Every year since 1993, each evaluation has arrived at the same conclusion: still mentally ill. He is 59 years old. He has been institutionalized for more than 30 years, longer than his victims had been alive when they died. His mother visits once a year. She is his only family contact. He shows no remorse. He has, on at least one occasion, demanded $10,000 in payment for a media interview. He dreams, according to the criminologist Ilana Kasoy, who has studied his case extensively, of visiting Disneyland and of winning $1 million. 14 boys are dead. No trial was ever held. The law made a determination about criminal responsibility, and the clinical evidence suggests the law may have been technically correct. Whether any of that constitutes justice for the families of 14 children is a question this case refuses to answer. Case number 9, Manuel Octavio Bermudez. Children in small towns across Valle del Cauca, Colombia, knew his cart. They knew his face. He was the ice cream vendor, someone you passed on the street, someone you bought from on a hot afternoon, someone whose presence in the neighborhood carried the specific and unexamined harmlessness of a familiar daily routine. He moved through communities that had no reason to distrust him, and every reason, in the logic of ordinary daily life, to find him entirely familiar. Nothing about him was visible that should have raised alarm. The pattern of disappearances in Valle del Cauca, in the years before his arrest, had not produced the kind of organized investigative response that might have connected the cases earlier. The region's municipalities each maintained their own records, their own investigations, their own understanding of what was happening locally. the broader picture that would only become visible with Bermudez's arrest. 21 children killed across multiple towns over 4 years, with a consistent method, a consistent victim profile, and a single perpetrator, was not something any single local investigation had assembled. The information was there. It was distributed across files that were never read together. His name was Manuel Octavio Bermudez. He was born on October 15th, 1961, in Trujillo, Valle del Cauca. Orphaned at birth, then adopted by a woman who, according to investigators' records, threw him from a balcony as an infant. The fall broke bones in his hand and foot and left him with a permanent limp that he carried for the rest of his life. He was transferred to a second family. That household was defined by an alcoholic and abusive father. Bermudez grew up inside that environment, eventually had children of his own, and found work as a vendor, moving through small rural communities with an ice cream cart, one of the most trusted and functionally invisible figures a child in a Colombian village can encounter. People see what they expect to see, and an ice cream vendor is exactly what he appeared to be. His victims were children from those same rural communities. Boys, mostly, lured away from the villages with the promise of money for a simple task, picking corn in the fields that stretched beyond the edge of town. It was the kind of offer that sounds entirely harmless. It was designed to sound entirely harmless. He would walk them far enough from the road that no one could hear what happened next. There, in the isolated cornfields of Valle del Cauca, he injected them with lidocaine to incapacitate them, then strangled them. He buried them where they fell, or very close to where they died. Between 1999 and 2003, this pattern repeated across multiple towns in the region. At least 21 children were killed. Investigators believed the actual number was closer to 50 or more, though only 17 bodies were ever recovered from the locations he eventually disclosed. The communities where the children lived felt the fear accumulating, a gathering unease that something was profoundly wrong, but couldn't identify its source. Neighbors compared notes. Parents warned their children to stay close. People noticed that boys were not coming home, but the pattern remained local, confined to individual towns, without the cross-referencing that would have revealed what was happening across the region. It was the kind of tragedy that requires someone to step back far enough to see the whole picture. And for years, no one did. A child going missing in a rural Colombian community in the early 2000s was not automatically a national event. It was a local grief. And local grief, in the absence of investigative resources and sustained outside attention, tends to remain local, to remain quiet, to remain unconnected to the grief of the community, 2 towns over, experiencing the same thing. The case broke in July 2003. A mother reported that her 12-year-old son, Luis Carlos Galvez, had gone missing, and that the ice cream vendor had been seen with him shortly before his disappearance. Investigators searched the room Bermudez rented in the town of El Cairo. What they found inside ended any ambiguity. Newspaper clippings of the murders he had committed, carefully kept and organized. Syringes, a vial of lidocaine, and the wristwatch that Luis Carlos Galvez had been wearing on the day he went missing. Bermudez was arrested on July 18th, 2003, at the age of 41. He confessed to 21 murders. He was convicted on March 20th, 2004, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. 25 years for 21 confirmed murders and suspected involvement in at least 24 more that were never formally charged. And honestly, it is the newspaper clippings found in that rented room that stay with you longer than almost any other detail in these 10 cases. Not the lidocaine, not the victim's watch. Those are evidence of method. The clippings are evidence of something else entirely. A man who followed the public reporting on his own crimes, who read the accounts, who assembled them, Who kept them in the room where he slept? Whatever that tells you about the psychology of the man, it is not something that belongs in the category of ordinary. Manuel Octavio Bermudez died on October 17th, 2024, 2 days past his 63rd birthday. He was killed in an ambush against the prison transport vehicle he was traveling in on the Pan American Highway in the Department of Cauca. His attackers have not been identified. He kept records of his own crimes. He knew what the world was saying about what he had done. He read those accounts carefully, by all appearances, and he kept reading. Case number 10, Daniel Camargo Barbosa. In 1974, Colombian authorities believed they had stopped him. He was arrested, he was convicted, he was sent to prison. And for a time, it seemed like the nightmare was over. It wasn't. His name was Daniel Camargo Barbosa. He was born on January 22nd, 1930, in the municipality of Analima, Cundinamarca, Colombia. His mother died before he was 1 year old. His father, distant and emotionally unavailable, remarried a woman who was abusive in a manner that left lasting marks. She dressed him in girls' clothing and sent him to school that way, engineering public humiliation in front of his classmates that he spoke about years later in ways that suggested it had never fully left his memory. Despite this, Barbosa was a strong student at the Leon's Third School in Bogota, with a reported IQ of 116. He was forced to drop out of school to contribute to the family's income. Whatever path that intelligence might have found was closed before it had a chance to open. His first arrest came in 1974, following a violent assault and murder in Colombia. He received an 8-year sentence related to the assault and a subsequent 25-year sentence for murder, and was sent to serve his time at Gorgona Island, Colombia's maximum security penal colony in the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by open water and dense jungle, a facility so remote and so difficult to escape from that it had been widely compared to Alcatraz. In November 1984, he escaped. He escaped from Gorgona Island, and after escaping, he went directly to Ecuador. And there, the killings resumed, not cautiously, not gradually, but immediately, and at a pace and scale that made it clear he had not spent his time in prison, reconsidering anything. The escape from Gorgona Island was not simply a security failure. It was an announcement made by the Colombian prison system's inadequacy that the people Barbosa would go on to kill. After his escape were deaths that could have been prevented. Every murder he committed in Ecuador after November 1984 occurred in the time created by that failure. Investigators working those cases years later had to contend not only with the grief of the families in front of them, but with the knowledge that the man responsible should not have been free. That knowledge does not simplify the case, it makes it heavier. Between his escape and his rearrest on February 26, 1986, Barbosa murdered dozens of young girls across Ecuador's provinces: Guayas, Pichincha, Tungurahua, El Oro, Los Rios. He admitted, after his capture, to 71 murders in Ecuador alone. Combined with the crimes he had committed in Colombia before his first imprisonment, investigators believed the confirmed total exceeded 72, with some estimates reaching considerably higher. His victims were young girls, primarily between 8 and 16 years old, approached in urban and rural settings with apparent gentleness before being taken to remote locations and killed. He received 2 nicknames that followed him through the rest of the case: El Sádico del Charquito, the sadist of El Charquito, and El Monstruo de los Manglares, the monster of the mangroves. Both captured something real about where and how he operated. Ecuadorian prosecutors assembled a case built on Barbosa's own admissions and on the physical evidence connecting him to the victims he had named. He did not dispute the facts. He admitted to what he had done with the kind of matter-of-fact directness that made the trial itself a relatively brief proceeding. What remained in dispute was not the killing, but the question of what the law could do with it. What sentence was proportionate? What legal framework applied? And whether the Ecuadorian system had any instrument adequate to what it was confronting. Ecuador tried and convicted him. The sentence was 16 years, the maximum the Ecuadorian legal system permitted at the time. And honestly, that number, 16 years for 71 confirmed murders committed after his escape from a maximum security prison, sits alongside the Lopez case and the Garavito sentencing as one of the most striking examples in this entire collection of legal systems that were not built to respond to what they were actually facing. The gap between the crime and the sentence was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind. He was serving that 16-year sentence in Garcia Moreno prison in Guayaquil, when, on November 13th, 1994, another inmate approached him and stabbed him to death. The inmate's name was Giovanni Arsenio Noguera Jaramillo. He was the nephew of one of Barbosa's victims. He had found the man responsible for his family's grief, and he had acted. Daniel Camargo Barbosa died at 64, having served approximately 8 years of a 16-year sentence for crimes whose confirmed toll stood at 72 lives, and whose actual toll remains unknown and may always remain so. When you look across all 10 of these cases, the different countries, the different decades, the different methods and circumstances and victims, one pattern stands out above all others. In almost every case, the legal systems these men encountered were not built to respond to what they actually were. Sentences that bore no relationship to the scale of the crimes. Laws that capped imprisonment at numbers that provided no meaningful answer to the families who had lost everything. Releases that returned convicted killers to the world. Escapes from maximum security facilities that should not have been possible. And behind every one of those institutional failures were families. Parents who waited years for answers that arrived too late or never arrived at all. Communities that lived inside fear while investigators failed to see what was right in front of them. Children who never came home. Long after the case numbers are assigned and the sentences are handed down, that is what remains.